Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Dose. It is the 8th of July version, or edition, I should say, of the Daily Dose, and I'm glad you have decided to join me today. I encourage everybody to share these lessons and let folks know that they're out there, and hopefully you found it encouraging and you can pass that encouragement along. For the last several weeks, we've been looking at little studied books of the Bible. They're typically the smaller books, but they're books that sometimes we just don't get around to studying. There are books that we enjoy. A lot of folks really focus in on the Gospels, and sometimes because of its gospel theme, the Book of Romans. And if we're having difficulties, we'll go over to Corinthians, and But how often do we really study Second John and Jude and Obadiah, and like now what we're doing, Nahum? Sometimes those books get a little bit neglected, and we find ourselves just having not read them for some time. So that's what we're doing. I want to encourage everybody before we get started. If you want to go ahead and turn there, we're in Nahum chapter 2. But before we get started, I want to encourage everybody to go into the chat, leave your updates, your prayer request, and share with us that good news. If you've had some prayer answered, if you have good news that you would like to share, leave your own bit of encouragement here in the chat, whether you're on Zoom or on the YouTube, then by all means, please do that as well, and it'll be much appreciated. And the one other thing, and I've mentioned this from time to time, not always, but if you have things about the program that you would like to see happen, for instance, if you have a book that you would like to talk about here, we can try to make that happen. If you have maybe even a topic that you would like to discuss, or if it's something that we're currently doing that you find particularly annoying or maybe frustrating, aside from internet connectivity, there's not much I can do about that right now. Just a lot of folks on because of the coronavirus stuff. But aside from that, if it's something that we do that you would like to see improved, or you can help us improve it, by all means, do that. Put that in the chat. Send me an email at edmenish@gmail.com, and I'm more than happy to look at those things. Always good to have constructive criticism. But we're over in chapter 2 of the book of Nahum. We've already looked at chapter 1. Chapter 1 is pretty much all about, Judah is going to be restored, having been persecuted by, Nineveh, and Nineveh was standing, against God, so Nineveh is going to be punished. And in chapter 2, it's all about the destruction of Nineveh. Now, what we have to know about God in the Bible is that there are a lot of scenes like this talked about in Scripture. We have other nations. We have Assyria. We have Judah. We have Israel. We have Babylon. We have so many nations that are talked about by the Bible as being punished or destroyed or brought low by God. We saw over in the book of Obadiah that even though they were, kind of as a city built into the side of a cliff, way up high in the mountains, God was going to, bring them low. He was going to, take away their pride, and he was going to humble them in such a way that would leave them, desolate. So this is just simply another scene in the Bible for destruction. Now, God's people were not immune to this either. You may recall they were taken into captivity at least twice in the Old Testament. We mentioned this yesterday as well. Once the northern kingdom taken by Assyria, which would be the Nineveh area, and then we see the southern kingdom taken captive for 70 years in Babylon. And then that's where we're introduced to guys like, Daniel, who is in that captivity, Nebuchadnezzar, who is the initial king, of that captivity, Daniel's friends, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, which is actually, their, except for Daniel, there's actually their, Babylonian names. Most of us don't even remember, their Israel names. But, that's a good example of the captivity. But even into the New Testament, forewarned and predicted is the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, we don't read about that destruction per se in the Bible. The Bible walks us right up to the edge of it, I believe. And then history records that in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was, cast down and wiped away from the top of, Mount Zion. And it's never been rebuilt. It's never been rebuilt. As a matter of fact, there's a mosque that sits there now. It's called the Dome of the Rock. But the Wailing Wall that people travel to each and every year over there in Jerusalem, that's actually a retention wall. A wall that they would put dirt behind to make the footprint of the temple area bigger. But it's just a retention wall. It's not even a wall of the original temple, because the original temple was totally laid to waste. So God's people were not immune. But Nineveh here is what we're going to read about. And we want to read, just a few verses. It's short, so we're just going to read the whole chapter. And I want us to notice just a few things. So we'll read it, we'll come back to it, and we'll pull out a couple of things that we can learn from. The scatterer has come up against you. Man the ramparts, watch the roads, dress for battle, collect all your strength. For the Lord is restoring the majesty of Jacob as the majesty of Israel. For plunderers have plundered them and ruined their branches. The shield of his mighty men is red with his soldiers. His soldiers are clothed in scarlet. The chariots come with flashing metal. On a day he musters them, and cypress spears are brandished. The chariots race madly through the streets. They rush to and fro from the squares. They gleam like torches. They dart like lightning. He remembers his officers. They stumble as they go. They hasten to the wall. The siege tower is set up. The river gates are open. The palace melts away. Its mistress is stripped. She is carried off, her slave girls lamenting, moaning like doves and beating their breasts. Nineveh is like a pool whose waters run away. Halt, halt, they cry, but none turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold. There is no end to the treasure of the wealth of all precious things. Desolate, desolation and ruin. Hearts melt and knees tremble. Anguish is in all loins. All faces grow pale. Where is the lion's den and the feeding place of the young lions? Where the lion and lioness went, where his cubs were, with none to disturb. The lion tore enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his lioness. He filled his caves with prey and his dens with torn flesh. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will burn your chariots in smoke, and and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard. All right, so it sounds like a pretty desolate thing, and you're thinking, man, how can that be a daily dose of encouragement? Well, believe it or not, there are some things in there that certainly should encourage us. But let's kind of break this chapter into a couple of different pieces. The first part of it, God is just simply, describing what is actually, happening. The armies there's an army coming out against Nineveh, and they are going to destroy Nineveh. He describes it, as a very simple thing, right? He talks about soldiers, and they're going to be fast, and they're going to be powerful, and they are going to be in chariots, and they're going to have torches, and they're going to have, weapons, and they're going to come in, and they are going to, rob you of your plunder. But then he gets into some more figurative language, but he's describing, the same thing. He says it's going to be like a river, and that river is going to come in, and it is going to wash away everything. It's going to carry off, men and women and children, and they're going to yell halt, but no one's going to turn, back. It's going to carry away the gold. It's going to carry away the silver. And then he finally gets down to, this end section where he describes, Nineveh as, lions, and how they too are going to be cut off. The sword shall devour your young lions. Well, the figurative language is used here because, Nineveh was a lion. At one point, they were the apex predator in the land. They were the most powerful nation. They went out and they captured other nations. That's why when you read Jonah, Jonah doesn't like them very much, because they are an invading, powerful, wicked, nation that carried people off in very vile and wicked ways. But here, the apex predator has been brought low. The cubs and the lioness and the lion, they're not going to, be that apex predator anymore. They shall no longer, and that's how it ends in verse 13. The messenger shall no longer be heard. So basically, you have three different ways of describing the same event, and you can't help but walk away with a sense of inevitability. In other words, no matter how you look at it, whether you're talking about the lions or from the perspective of the Ninevites, or you're talking about from the perspective of Jacob or God's people, or whether you're talking about it from the perspective of what they do, that is the flood, they carry things away. It's going to happen. There is going to be this desolation. Hearts are going to melt, knees are going to tremble, anguish and it will be in all the loins, and all of the faces will grow pale. Right? No one's coming to help. You're left on your own, and you are going to suffer, desolation. So again, how is there a note of encouragement here? Well, there is for us, because we can know very clearly that when we act in wicked ways, we have to expect a consequence. When we act in ways that are contrary to God, then we have got to take responsibility. All right, but that's not the real thing I want to point out. I think most of us know that, and we've talked about that. You reap what you sow. But I want to go back and I want to point out something that is not in the chapter, but it actually is. The chapter is built upon it, and that is that this is not the first time that these folks were told about their wickedness. Right? If you go back, years, again, go back to the time of Jonah, they were doing wickedness then, but then they all repented. They all came back to it. Well, what happened? Well, at some point they moved away from God and his word. They became, once again, irresponsible and weren't doing what God wanted them to do. So God is sending the army. God is sending the flood. God is shutting the mouth of the lion, the devouring apex predator nation, and he is going to bring them to, desolation, which, for us, knowing that and knowing the end, it should remind us of two basic, simple points about the character of God. Number one, God is long-suffering. The fact that we're reading this book, an account, shows that, he cares about them. He wanted them to do the right thing. And year after year after year, and prophet after prophet after prophet, including Nahum, including, Jonah, he sends them, messages of warning, telling them, this is what's going to happen if you keep walking down that road. So all of this speaks to us about, God is a merciful God. He is a merciful God, and he wants everybody to come, to repentance. But number two, there is a time in which that mercy runs out. All right? There's a time in which mercy is, not going to be extended. We have, drawn on the patience of God so much that it's time for him to say enough. Right? You can go back and you can see this over and over in the Bible. You go back to the days of, Noah and the building of the ark, and God repented that he had ever made man. You remember that? And he says he's going to destroy them, but Noah found what? Grace, therefore mercy in the eyes of God. I mean, how many years had gone by before, God said that? For years he was long-suffering. For years he was patient. And he gave them warning. Right? And go forward to the time of the Judges, the dark ages of, that ancient Bible history. And you find the same thing. Israel caught in a cycle of sin, God sends a warning over and over and over and over and over. And finally they go into captivity, and then God has to send a judge to save them. It's the cycle of sin. It's constant. But God is merciful, and so he sends the judges, and they deliver. And then, of course, with Israel, later on in the period of the kings, they get in that cycle again. There are more wicked kings in Israel than there are good kings, and they constantly move away from God, and he sends them into this captivity. Assyria sends them into the Babylonian captivity. But then at the end of it all, after 70 years, God brings a remnant back. The remnant of the righteous, he brings back. He extends that mercy. And the same thing is true for us today. When we think that we've done something so wrong, so bad, that, we can't be forgiven, God says, I will forgive. I will forgive you. But you know what? It's going to require you changing. It's going to require you making some changes in your life, changing the way you think, changing the things that you do, changing the things that you say. It's going to require that. And if you don't want to do that, then you will be held ultimately responsible for the things that you do. And we call that day of judgment, where we're all going to have to stand before him and we're going to have to give an account. And unless we've been washed, cleansed by the blood of Christ that we experienced through hearing his word and believing and repenting and confessing our sins and being baptized, if we don't have Christ there as our advocate because we have become his follower, then we will be held responsible eternally for the things that are in our life. But again, the main lesson here, even that, is something that, tells us about the dependability of God, that, he will always hold those responsible. But he wants to extend mercy, and he wants people to embrace him for that kindness, that goodness that he extends to all of us. So yes, this is a chapter about destruction, but it's not wanton destruction. It's destruction that has been built upon over a course of many years after receiving so many warnings and so many extensions of mercy that God finally said, enough. Does God look at your life and say, enough? Or are there things that we need to lay on the altar of God's mercy today? Don't let the day go by without doing that. And likewise, when we see others in that position, maybe we can be the person who warns. Maybe we should be the person who is extending that mercy of God. Appreciate everybody coming out today. This has been your Daily Dose.